Hello everyone, we are going to build this recipe application in React. So before we dive into it, let me just give you a quick demo of how it's going to work. Essentially, it grabs the recipes from an external API. So this is what happens when the page first loads. And then from there on, we can search for recipes. So if I type in shrimp, it's going to give me the recipes that involve shrimp. And then if I type in chicken, it's going to give me the recipes that involve chicken. From there on, we can view the recipe by clicking this View Recipe button, and then it takes us to that recipe using React Router. Once it's been loaded, we can go back to the home page by pressing this Go Home button, and it takes us back to home page again using React Router. Now, you may notice that the results that we looked for are still there, and this is because we are using data persistence to store our data locally. For this project, you are expected to have a little bit of knowledge of JavaScript, React, and React Router. Okay, so without any further ado, let's get started. Alright, so to get started, I've already created a project folder for you using the Create React App CLI. So inside of this folder, I've included the CSS that I've written for this project, which lives right there, so feel free to take a look at it. And I've also installed the packages that we're going to need for this project. So I've installed Bootstrap, and I've also installed this React Router DOM package. And these three, they already come built into a Create React App project. Okay, so I will link this project in the video description, so go and download it. And once you have downloaded it, just go ahead and navigate to it in your terminal. Type in npm install to install all the packages and the node modules folder. And once you've done that, just type in npm start or yarn start to launch this project into your web browser. Okay, so come on. This is what we are going to start with. It's just a blank screen with basically a header and a title that reads recipe search. And this is what's going on in this app.js file. Okay, so as you know, we are going to type in the values, well, the names of the recipes to search for them. So how do we actually search for recipes? Well, we need the input form. So to do that, let's just first create a new folder in this source folder. And I'm going to name it components. Within this components folder, let's just create a new file and call it form.js. Alright, in there, first things first, we need to import React from React. And then I'm going to create a stateless functional component, and I'm going to call it form. And it's going to be a stateless functional component because we don't need any state in this component. So if a component doesn't need any state, that means we can make it a stateless functional component and not a class-based component. Alright, so I'm just going to implicitly return some JSX. So inside of it, I'm going to create a form. Come on. And we don't need the action. So inside of this form, let's just create a new input. The type of text. Let's get rid of this ID and the name for now. And I'm also going to create a button that says search. And before I forget, let's just go ahead and export this right here at the bottom. So export default form. Excellent. Now let's go back to app.js and import this. So import form from, and then we need to stay in the same directory, go into the components directory, and then import form. Alright, so let's just render it out right there just below the header. So there we go. Let's go back to the web browser and make sure that it's showing up. Yes, it is. So let's just create a method inside of this component and hook it up to this form.js because we need to first make sure that everything is working correctly. So I'm going to call this method getRecipe, and this method is going to be responsible for making the API call, okay? And let's set it to a arrow function. Now, this syntax may look a bit weird to you. You may be used to seeing something like a constructor function, and then inside of it, you basically type in your methods like this, and then you have to hook them up in your constructor function like this dot get recipe equals this dot get recipe dot bind, and then you bind in your methods, whatever. Well, this has been removed, or you can say that deprecated in React 16. So essentially in React 16 you don't really need a constructor function. You can even declare your state without a constructor function, just like that. Okay, so this is just a neat bit of syntax in the new version of React, and I think this is much better and much more practical than the previous versions. Anyway, getting back to the topic, first of all, let's just console.log something into this method just to make sure that it's working fine. So I'm just going to console.log saying working. But how do we hook it up to this form component? Well, we first need to go ahead and pass this data to this form component. And how do you pass data to another component? You use props. So I'm going to name this prop the same as this method. So I'm going to say get recipe equals this. So this refers to this app component, and then this dot get recipe. Okay. Press save. Now back in form.js, we do have access to this get recipe prop because we set it up right there. But to access it, we can't really use the this.props approach because this keyword only works in class-based components. But this is a stateless functional component, which means we have to pass an argument right there called props. Now with this props refers to these right there. So whatever get passed in there gets stored into this argument. So this props is basically an object. So to access the properties of an object, you type in, well, props dot and then whatever the name of the property is. Now in our case, we are going to set up an attribute called onSubmit, which is a built-in React attribute. And then we can say props dot and then the name of the prop is get recipe. So let's just copy it and place it right there. Excellent. Press save, app.js. And now what do we want? Well, we want this console.log to show up as soon as we press this button. So now if I open up my developer tools, go to the console, press search. Ooh, what's happening there? Well, keep your eye right about there. As soon as I press the search button, keep your eye there. Did you see that? That working console log appeared for like just a split second, but then it disappeared. And this is because we are going through a full page refresh. This full page refresh is the default behavior of any web page. And to change that, all we need to do is we need to pass in an argument e. Actually, let me just convert that to a arrow function first, so I don't have to bind it. So this e is basically the event object in JavaScript. This is nothing specific to React. So since this is an object, means we can access the properties of this object. So I can say e.prevent default. And this method is going to prevent the default behavior of this web page, which is what? That is going to refresh. So now if I press save, go back to the web browser, press search, we can see that the working console log is showing up. Brilliant. Okay, well, what do we need to do next? Well, we need to first, let's just make sure that we are actually reading the values that we type in there. So first of all, we need to set up a name attribute because this is what we're going to use to read the values from the input. Okay, so name, and I'm gonna name it recipe, or let's just call it recipe name. Okay, I'm gonna copy this, and within this get recipe method, I'm gonna create a new constant, and I'm gonna call it same as that, recipe name equals. So again, this event object means we can read the properties from it. So e.target.elements, and then what do we need to access? Well, we need to access this name attribute. So what's the name of this name attribute? It's recipe name. So e.target.elements.name .recipe name, and then what do we need to access from it? We need to access its value. So .value. Okay. Now instead of console logging this working string, let's just actually console.log this recipe name constant that we just created. Right, so let's go back to the web browser and type in anything, type in chicken, press search, and there we go. This is working just fine. Okay, now let's get into some more interesting stuff. We need to make an API call to a website, and then we are reading the data from the website and showing up to our web application. And what's the website that we need to make the API call to? Well, it's this recipe API called food to fork. That's kind of a weird name, but foodtofork.com/about/API. Now you can read this, but for the most part, all you need to do is you first need to sign up for the website. It's completely free, and you need to obtain an API key because you need that in order to work with their data. Essentially, an API key is a way for websites to know who you are and what kind of data you're trying to access. So they use your API key that are associated to your email address, and then they just basically want to know what kind of data you're trying to access. That's the whole purpose of obtaining the API keys. Okay, so all you need to do is just press this sign up button, and then it will redirect you back to this page once you have got your API key. So the URL that we need to make the API call to lives right there. Now see, this is the URL that we need, and see this key parameter right there. This is where your API key should go. So once you have done that, your URL should look something like this right there. See, this is the exact same API right there. This is the exact same URL. Apart from the fact that this API key variable has been replaced by my actual API key. So all I did was I first signed up, then I copied this URL, I pasted it right there, and then instead of this API key wrapped within those curly braces, I just pasted my API key right there. And what are we looking for by default? We are looking for this shredded chicken. And these are the results that we are getting back. And you may also notice that there's also this count parameter right there, and we can change that. We will do that later on in the video, but we can change that to anything. We can change that to 5, 10, 15, whatever you like. It just depends on how many results you want to show. So in this case, the count is set to 5, which means we are getting an array of recipes, and this array has 5 different objects. And then you see that these are the properties that we're going to read in order to access the data. So there's publisher, title, recipe ID, just some of these we're going to use in our web application. Okay, so let's actually go ahead and copy this URL. Okay, go back to our application, and I'm actually going to just go ahead and create a new constant. But all I'm going to do there is I'm first going to extract my API key because I'm going to store that in a new constant. So there we go. Because it's always a good practice to just store your important data into your own constants in case you need it later on. Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and create a new string and paste my API key right there. Okay, so once that's been done, we are now ready to make the HTTP call to this URL right there. So to do that, I'm first going to go ahead and cut this link out, just like that. And inside of this getRecipe method, just below this prevent default call, I'm going to create a new constant, and I'm going to call it API_call. And for now, I'm just going to go ahead and initialize a string, and inside of that I'm going to paste this link right there. That doesn't seem right. Let's just fix that. There we go. Okay, so we're going to make use of something called Async Await and the Fetch API to make the call to this link right there. So how do you initialize a Async Await function, or in this case, how do we make this method asynchronous? Well, just before we declare the method, we're going to type the keyword async. Okay, and then right where we're making the API call, we type in the keyword await. And to actually make the HTTP call, we're going to use the fetch API. So to do that, I'm again going to go ahead and cut this link out. And I'm going to type in the keyword fetch. And within there, instead of initializing the string, I'm going to use the ES6 template literals. So to do that, it's just using the backticks, and then I'm going to paste the link right there. So we need to change a couple of things now, because remember, we have our API key stored in this constant right there. So in ES6 template literals, we are allowed to inject the variables inside our string. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and copy this API key constant, and we're going to inject it right there where the key is required. So to insert a template literal, all you do is you type in the $, and then a couple of curly braces, and then whatever goes inside of these curly braces is basically what we want to do. So in this case, we just want to inject this API key variable. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this and paste it right there. And what do we need to do next? Well, the default search for now is just shredded chicken right there. Later on, we will change that to whatever we type into our form, but for now, let's just leave it to shredded chicken. Okay, so I'm actually going to get rid of this console log right there because we don't need that anymore. So this is just making the API call. It's not actually grabbing any kind of data. So to do that, I'm actually going to create a new constant, and I'm going to call it results, or let's just call it data. And we're going to set it to the return value of this fetch function right there. So again, to grab the value, we're going to first type the keyword await. Okay. And then we also need to convert this, whatever we get back from this API, to a JSON format. So you may be used to seeing something like, JSON.parse or JSON.stringify, but watch how clean this is in Fetch API. All you need to do is you need to type in the constant's name, which in our case is API call, and then we just call the JSON method. There we go, just like so. Okay, so now whatever we get back from the API is going to be stored in this data constant right there. So let's just check what's inside of this data constant. So if I console log this data object, now remember, this method is going to fire as soon as we press this button right there. So now let's just go back to our application and press search. What's that? No access control allow origin. Some websites do not allow local servers to access their data. Now in our case, we are using our localhost 3000 to access the data from this Food to Fork website. So we need to do something to trick this Food to Fork servers into thinking that we are a legitimate website. So in other words, we are live on the servers. So how do we fix that? Well, there's a very handy tool for that. It's called courseanywhere.heroku.com. So all we need to do is we need to go ahead and copy this URL, okay? And go back to our application, and just before our link begins, we just prefix it with this URL that we just copied right there. All this is going to do is it's going to trick this website into thinking that our server, which in our case is localhost, this is actually a live server that lives somewhere on the internet. Okay, that's all this URL is going to do. So now if I press save and then go back to our application, press search, and hopefully this should give us some sort of data, and yes, it does. So this essentially is an object, and the value of that is this data constant right there. So if I expand it, this is the count. So remember, we're getting an array of 5 objects because we have set the count to 5. So if I change the count to, let's say, 10, let's see what we get back. So press search, and there we go. We get an array of 10 objects. So let's just go ahead and crack open this recipe array, and let's take a look at what's inside of these. Well, it's basically, like I said, it's an array, and inside of that is just a count of objects. So that count is what we type in right there. So let's just crack open the first one. So these are just a bunch of properties that we're going to use in order to display the data on our website. So what do we need here? Well, to actually access this data, what we need to do is we need to drill down into this array first, this recipes array. So we're going to have to say something like data. So remember, data is this whole object. So to drill down into recipes, we have to say data.recipes. And now if I console log this, we get back the array that we need. So this is the array, and let's just say that we want to go to this first element in this array. So I can say data. So again, to access a number in an array, you use the index. In this case, it's 0. So we want to access the first element, and inside of that, let's just try and access this recipe ID. So let's just copy that and paste it right there. And let's see what we get back. So press search, and there we go, we get the recipe ID back. But this isn't what we want. We actually want to display the data on our actual web page, which is this whole thing right there. So how do we do that? Well, let's take a look. So to actually display this piece of data, we don't really have anywhere to store that inside of. Sure, we do have this constant called data, but this only exists inside of this method. So now would be a good time to introduce state within our application. So to do that, I'm just going to type in the keyword state, and I'm just going to set it to an empty object. Now again, you might be used to doing something like typing in a constructor and then declaring your state like that. But like I said, in React 16 and further on, you don't need the constructor function at all. So you can just delete that altogether. And what you can do is you can just simply declare your state like that. So what kind of state do we want to trace? What we want to do is we want to set up an array which is going to store whatever we get back from the API. And what do we get back? We get back an array. So to do that, let's just create a first piece of state called recipes and set it to an empty array. Excellent. Now, how do we actually make use of this state right there? Well, instead of console logging this piece of data right there, let's just do something else. Let's just use the built-in setState method to set this piece of data to this recipes array. So to do that, I'm just going to say this dot set state, and it's going to take an object, and within there we want to grab the recipes state, and we want to set it to data just like that. Okay, so now instead of console logging what we get back from this data, let's console log this piece of state right there. So console.log and this dot state dot recipes. Okay, let's go back to the web browser, open up our console, press search, and we should get back our piece of state, and that we do. And inside of this piece of state we have an object, and then inside of that object is this recipes array right there. So all we want to do right there is we only want this array right there. So to do that, let's just say data dot and then is this recipes array right there, because we want to set this recipes array to this recipes array right there. Okay, so data dot recipes. There we go. Go back to the web browser, press search, and now all we get back is an array, and within that array there's just a bunch of objects. So this is all well and good, but how do we actually display this data onto our actual screen? So to do that, let's just do something more interesting. For now, all I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a JavaScript expression right there, which means, and by the way, in JSX, opening up a pair of curly braces means that you want to inject something that is related to JavaScript. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to make use of an array method called map. Now, map is a new method that was introduced in a later version of JavaScript, and essentially it allows you to go through each element inside of an array, and then you can manipulate it, you can change it, anything you want to do with it. So it's kind of like the for each method, but in JSX we can't really use the for loop or the for each loop, so we're gonna have to make do with what we have. So what we have here is the array method, array.map method. So in this case, the recipe state is an array, so all we can do is we can say this dot state dot recipes, and then we call in the method called map, and this method takes a callback function. So let's just give it a callback function, and we also give it a argument right there, an argument I should say, or a parameter. And this parameter is going to contain each of the elements that are inside of this recipes array once the state has been set. So let's just call it a individual recipes, just like that. And then within there, let's just return a paragraph that says, and again, since we're going to make use of this JavaScript thing inside of this JSX paragraph tags, we have to introduce curly braces. So what do we want to access? Well, for now, let's just say recipe, and then let's just crack open one of these and recipe.title. For now, let's just print out recipe.title. So remember, it's going to print out 10 different titles on the screen because it's going to loop through each of these elements right there, and the number of them is 10. So we're going to get 10 titles printing out to the screen. Okay, so again, press save, go back to the web browser. There are no errors, which is good. So now if I press search, I should get some titles onto the screen. Yes, we do. This is brilliant, but we also have an error. It reads, each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. And this error is something to do with React. Essentially, it's asking us to set a parameter called key to each of these elements that have been looped over. And the reason for this is that React wants to know what each of these elements are. I mean, there is no way for React to know what this title is, what this title is. All it's doing is it's reading the properties of each of the objects right there. But it also needs to know that in future, in case we need to manipulate any of these, so React can just grab the key prop, and then from there it can do its thing. So to do that, all I'm going to do is I'm going to set this recipe ID, which is this right there. I can also set the title or the source URL as long as it's something unique and different to compared to the other objects, it will do. But just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to say that key equals, and again I'm going to have to open up a JavaScript expression, and inside of this I'm going to say recipe.recipe_id. Now if I press save and go back to the web browser, press search, we can see that all the titles are printing out to the screen, and we also don't have any errors. This is just a ESLint complaining that recipe name has been declared but it's not been used. And this isn't really something to worry about. So let's just move on. So currently we are just getting the default value, which is this shredded chicken right there. But what we want to do is we want to get the results of whatever the user types into this input form right there. So to change that, we already have a value from that form which we grabbed earlier on using the event object. So all we can do is we can use this recipe name constant, and like I said, this is a template string, so we can actually inject this variable right there instead of this shredded chicken. So what I can do is I can just cut this out, okay, and then to open up a template literal, you type in the $, followed by a pair of curly braces, and then within there we can inject this variable right there, just like that. Okay, press save, go back to the web browser, and now if we type in, let's say shrimp, press search, and we are indeed getting the results that involve shrimp on the screen as well as in the console right there. Okay, so what's next? So let's actually grab a bit more than just the titles. So if I just crack open one of these objects right there, we can use a bunch of properties there. So what we're going to use is we're going to use this title, which we already use, and we're also going to use this publisher name, and we're also going to use this image URL. But for now, let's just throw in this image and see how it goes. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this. Going to go back to our application, and instead of just returning this one single paragraph, let's actually just code it out. Open up a pair of parentheses, and inside of it, let's create a div, throw in that paragraph tag, and let's also add in a image tag just above this paragraph tag. So, and the source is going to be actually this recipe dot and then the image URL. So as always, to open up a JavaScript expression, you have to throw in a pair of curly braces and then recipe and then image URL. So what kind of description do we need to give it to this image tag? Well, we can just throw in the title there, just like we did right there. So we can say, again, to initialize a JavaScript expression, come on, we have to first open up a pair of curly braces and then recipe dot title. Excellent. Now, if you go back to the web browser and press search, let's look for pizza this time. And we should get back the images. They look hideous at the moment, but we will fix that. So why is this giving an error again? This key prop error, even though we have already passed the key right there. Well, the error here is that the key has to be passed within the most parent element. So what's the most parent element in this case? Well, it's this div right there. So I'm just going to cut this out and paste it right there, just like that. So now if you go back to our application, press pizza, and yeah, it's working out fine, but it's looking rather hideous at the moment. So we're going to fix that next. So to do that, we're going to make use of Bootstrap, which I already have included in our package.json and as well as our index.js file right there. So to make use of Bootstrap, we're just going to add a bunch of classes from the Bootstrap framework. But before we do that, let's take care of this piece of code right there. All we are doing there is we are mapping over this piece of state right there. But this is a bit messy. I mean, we don't want to do that in our app component. So to take care of that, let's just transfer this into its own component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new component in the components folder, and I'm going to call it recipes.js. Okay, once I'm in there, we're just going to import React from React. After that, let's just create a stateless functional component because again, we don't need any state in there. So we can make this a stateless functional component. So to do that, I'm just going to call it recipes, and I'm going to set it equal to an arrow function, and I'm going to implicitly return some JSX. So first of all, I'm just going to return a div, and within this div, for now, let's just type in recipes just to make sure that it's working. And right there, let's just export default at the bottom. Excellent. Now let's go back to our app.js file, and just underneath this form component, let's import the recipes. So import recipes from, and then it's the components directory, and then recipes. Okay, so I'm actually going to cut this out, and I'm just going to go ahead and render out a recipes component. Press save, go back to the web browser, and we do have our recipes component showing up. Okay, but we don't want it to just render out this text. We want it to actually display the data that we were previously getting. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, we need to pass this state, this recipes array, to this recipes component, and then inside of this recipes component, that is where we're going to map over that piece of state right there. So how do we pass this piece of state to our recipes components? Well, as always, to pass anything inside of React, you have to use props. So to do that, I'm just gonna pass a new props and I'm gonna call it recipes, okay? And I'm gonna set it to this.state.recipes. Excellent. So now this prop means that we do have access to our recipe state that lives there. So now back in recipes.js file, to get access to this prop right there, we first need to pass in an argument right there called props, because this is the only way we can access the props. We can't really say something like this.props.whatever, because the this keyword will not work inside of this JSX that lives inside of this arrow function. Okay, if it was a class-based component, then we could have used it, but in stateless functional components, there's no way we can access the props using this keyword. Okay, so now how do we proceed with our recipes props? Well, it's the same as what we did right there. So I'm actually just going to paste the piece of code that I cut earlier, and all I'm going to do within there is I'm going to get rid of this keyword, and I'm also going to get rid of this state because the state does not exist in this component. Instead, I'm going to type in props, and what's the name of the prop is this recipe. So props.recipes, and then it's the exact same thing that we have been following. So again, let's just break it down. We pass the props property, we pass the props argument. That props argument has access to this recipes prop right there. And then inside of this div, all we are doing is we are mapping over this piece of state right there, and this gets filled once this search recipe button gets called. Okay, and then once that's been called, that means that this prop has access to this piece of state right there, which means we can actually map over inside of another component, and that component right now is this recipes component. Okay, a lot of talking. Now let's save the file, go back to the web browser, and see if that works. Let's just open up the console and let's look for chicken, press search, and we are indeed getting back 10 different values, 10 different recipes for the chicken. And this is brilliant. So now that we have taken care of this recipes component, let's go ahead and actually style our application because it looks very ugly right now. So let's continue with that. So when I say styling, I mean that I'm just gonna add a bunch of CSS properties that I've already declared inside of this app.css file. So if something doesn't make sense to you, then I've named these classes very appropriately. So just have a look at this file and it should make everything clear to you. And like I said before, I've already installed Bootstrap into this project as well. And this is being imported right there inside of this index.js file. And we're going to make use of Bootstrap as well. Okay, so we're not really going to make any changes to this app.js file. Instead, let's just first open up this form.js file, and this is where we're going to get started with our styling. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a style attribute right there. And this takes a JavaScript expression, and then inside of it, you can declare an object, and then there you can define your styles. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a margin bottom, okay, and I'm going to set it to rem. Okay, now next step I'm going to do is press save, and I'm going to give this input a class name of form __ input, copy that, and I'm going to give this button a class name of form __ button. Brilliant. Let's just go back to our application now, and we can see that the styles are being applied. Okay, now for the main styling, we're going to stay in this recipes.js file. So right now it's very simple, but we're going to completely transform this structure right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and cut this whole thing out just like that. So start with a div. Okay, so this div is going to act as a Bootstrap container. Okay, and inside of this div, let's just throw in a row. Okay, now next up, what do we need to do? Well, this is where we are going to throw in our map function. Okay, so to do that, let me just take a look at what I'm doing here, because this tutorial is not scripted, so I just really need to be careful with the classes so I don't mess anything up. Anyway, so I need to add the Bootstrap columns. So what would be the best place to do that? Well, this is one individual div that's being rendered out to the web browser. So that means this would be an ideal place to throw in the Bootstrap column class. Okay, so to do that, I'm actually going to cut this whole thing out just like that. Create a new class, and I'm going to call it col-md-4. Excellent. So now let's just go ahead and open up this div, and inside of this div, let's also throw in another class name and call it recipe__box. Brilliant. Okay, let's carry on. And what do we need to do next? Well, seeing as we are mapping over, we are throwing in this div inside of this map function, that means we have access to every property that this recipe has. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to throw in an image tag, and the source is going to be again recipe dot, I believe it was image_URL, and the alt was recipe dot, I believe it was title. Yes, it was. Okay, what's next? Well, let's also give this image a class. So I'm going to say class name, and I'm going to set it equal to recipe__box, and then it's img. Let's just break these attributes down to their own lines, just so it's a bit more clear. Okay, let's indent that in. Let's get rid of that there. Okay, so what's next? Well, after the image tag, let's just go ahead and underneath this image tag, let's open up a div and call it recipe__text. Okay, inside of there, what are we doing? Well, let's open up a JavaScript expression, because this is where we're going to throw out our recipe title. So let's just say recipe.title. Okay, and let's wrap this inside of a h5 tag, just so it actually looks like a title. So recipe, come on this recipe.title. Okay, let's just take a look at how it's looking like so far. Well, it says rec is not defined, so line number 12, and yeah, of course it's not defined. So press save and go back to the web browser. Let's just close that for now and press pizza, search, and see what we get back. Well, we are getting stuff back, but it's not looking very promising at the moment. So let's just go ahead and fix this. So the source for this tag is, of course, this image URL. So I typed in img. Anyway, let's take a look at it now. So pizza, search, and this is looking much better now. Okay, well, what is next? Well, let's also grab another property from this array called publisher. Okay, this one right there. And again, it's complaining about that key prop, and we will pass that in a moment. In fact, let's just do it right now. So what's the most parent div is this component right there. So sorry, this div right there. So let's just say the key equals recipe.title, and that should fix it. And while I'm here, let's also give this each of the columns a bit of spacing towards the bottom. So I'm going to say style equals, and then an object, that says margin bottom is, let's just give it 2 rem. Okay, press save. So what is next? Well, we were going to throw in the publisher. So to do that, let's just, shall we throw in a paragraph tag right there? Yeah, staying inside of this div. Let's just throw in a paragraph tag and give it a class of recipes underscore title. And let's also copy this class and paste it right there. And this should be title and this should be subtitle. Okay. So let's just type in publisher so this shows up, and then let's throw that in a span tag. So span, and then inside of this span, what do we need to do? Well, let's just open up a JavaScript expression and type in recipe.publisher. Okay, so what is next? So we're also going to add a button which we can click and then we get taken to the recipe. And we will hook that up using React Router later on, but for now, let's just go ahead and add it. So below this, this recipe underscore text div, let's just open up a button tag, okay? And call it, for now, let's just call it view recipe. And give it a class of recipe underscore button. Brilliant. Now let's go back to our application and this should look the way we want it to look. Okay, it's looking promising for the most part, but I still kind of don't like the way it's looking, so I probably mistyped something. So I think the class name is recipe buttons actually. It is. And this should be recipe text. And this should be recipe. This should be recipes box. Okay, my mistake. Okay, let's go back to our application. Again, press search. Okay, this is looking good, but again, it's not perfect. And I'm pretty sure that I'm typing out the class names somewhere wrong. So it's recipe underscore buttons. Actually, I think I just typed 1 underscore right there. So now if I press search, there we go. This is looking much better now. So see, I don't like how some of these boxes are longer in height and some are small in height. So let's just type in something else. So chicken. See, notice that, when the name gets longer, the box itself gets longer as well. So how do we fix that? Well, let's just make use of something very handy inside of JavaScript. So to do that, we're gonna do this inside of this recipe title. So we're gonna make use of a JavaScript method called Substring. So it's better to explain it while we do it. So let's just open up, let's just expand this h5 tag right there. Let's put that in a separate line. And right there, what we're going to do is we're going to say if recipes.title, okay, so .length. So remember, this is a string, and strings in JavaScript have a property called length. So we can check that if recipe.title.length is smaller than 20, okay, so we're using the ternary operator right there. So it kind of works like if-else statement, but we can't really use if-else statements inside of JSX, so we're going to have to make do with the ternary operator. Okay, so if recipe.title.length is smaller than 20, then this question mark refers the then clause inside of the if-else statement. Then what we want to do is we want to open up a template string, and inside of it, we're just going to render out a recipe. Oops, that's not how it should be. It should be like that. We're going to render out just the recipe.title as it is. So if the length of the title is less than 20 characters, then we are just going to render out the recipe title just as it is. Okay? Else, so this colon stands for else. So if this condition isn't true, then this is what's going to happen. So else, let's open up a template string again, else recipe dot title dot, and this is where we're going to make use of the substring method inside of JavaScript. Okay, so this essentially takes a couple of arguments. The first one is where it's going to start, and the second one is where we want our string to trim. So if the length of the title is smaller than 20 characters, that means it can fix inside of just one box. If it's greater than 20 characters, which this one is, what we can do is we can cut it down to just 25 characters. So to do that, we need to start with the first index. So the first letter, which is right there, and the index of that is 0. So 0, and then we just want to trim it down to 25 characters. So this is what the second argument is going to be. Okay, so once it's been done, once the character has been trimmed, let's also give the user some kind of feedback that this string is longer than it's appearing out to be. So to do that, let's just type in 3 dots right there. Okay, go back to the web browser. Again, search for chicken, press search, and now we can see that the titles that are longer than 20 characters have this kind of a nice, 3 ellipses showing up right there. And those titles that are smaller than 20 characters, they are just showing in their full length. And this is exactly what we wanted to do. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so now we're gonna add React Router to our application. More specifically, we're gonna make this view recipe button work. Okay, so to do that, we're obviously going to need React Router, and I did tell you earlier that I already have installed the React Router package, which lives right there. Okay, so what we're going to do for that is we're going to create a new component inside of this components folder, and we're going to call it router.js. And this component is ultimately going to replace this app component which currently lives inside of this index.js file, and this is what we're going to render out to the web browser. Okay, so what do we actually need inside of this router component? Well, obviously we need React, so import React from React, and we're also going to grab a bunch of named exports from this React Router DOM package. So we're going to grab, in fact, let's just first say import and then React Router DOM, and then we can type in the properties. So we need browser router, we need switch, and we also need, what do we need? Route. Okay, if you are new to React Router, then I highly recommend you first learn about React Router, and I do have a video for that on my channel, so go check that out. It will give you a basic idea of React Router and how it works. Okay, so now you may notice that this new update in VS Code, it basically doesn't give you any highlighting unless you use the variables that you are using in your application. So let's say that this React, it's not highlighted, it's usually in colors, and the reason it's appearing this dim is because we haven't used it yet. So this is a nice way of VS Code to tell you that this is the stuff that you haven't used yet, so use it. Okay, so now if I just create a new component and I'm going to call it router, and I'm going to set it to a stateless functional component, and let's just make it return some JSX. So now, as soon as I create this div, you can see that this line gets highlighted, and this is because React has, and this is because VS Code has told us that this thing right there has been used. But we haven't used any of these properties yet, so this is why they're still appearing gray. Okay, coming back to the topic. So we don't actually need this div. What we're going to do is we're going to wrap everything inside of this browser router. So I'm going to place it right there. And inside of it, what do we need? Well, we need our routes. So to throw in our routes, we just type in route, and it's a self-closing tag, and inside of it we add a component attribute, and we also add a, I believe it's path, yeah, but I think that comes before the component. So path equals and anything that goes inside of it. Okay, so how are we going to structure this? Well, for the home component, which obviously gets represented by this forward slash, so if the path is this forward slash, then we are going to show up our app.js components. So app.js is obviously this whole thing right there. So to do that, we first need to import our app component. So import app from, and then we need to jump up our directory and then this app. So if the path is this forward slash, then show us this app component. And we're also going to add a new route, and that route is going to be that individual recipe, whatever we click on. So we don't really have any component for that yet, but for the time being, let's just create a new component and call it recipe. Now, pay attention, this is recipe and this is just an individual recipe. Okay, it's very easy to make mistakes, so just pay attention right there. Create a new component, import React from React, and then just create a stateless functional component for now anyway, and let's call it recipe and set it to an arrow function, and let's just implicitly return some JSX. Okay, div, and let's just type in recipe component and export this right here at the bottom. So export defaults recipe. Excellent. Now we need to actually import this into our router because this is what we're going to use in order to render it out. So import recipe from, and then it's in the same directory, so recipe right there. Okay, I'm just going to duplicate this line, and I'm going to say that if so, what path do we need? Well, it's going to be a bit more complicated than what we're used to, but for now, let's just throw in the path recipe. So if the path is forward slash recipe, then render out this recipe component. Okay, well, currently it's not going to work because this router file only exists in our components folder and we actually need to make use of it. So to make use of it, let's just go back to our index.js file and let's completely trash this app component right there. And instead, let's import, I believe it's router from, and then I think it's in the components folder and then router. Okay. So now instead of this app component, we're going to make use of this router component right there. Okay, press save, go back to the web browser, and it says export defaults imported as router was not found. And I know what the mistake is. Back in router.js, we need to make use of this switch statement right there. So to do that, let's just type switch and then throw in our routes. And I also forgot to export this, so export defaults and then router. So now if I go back to the web browser, we can see that we have our app component in all its glory, and we can still search for recipes. So if I type in chicken, I can get the results that involve chicken. And then right there, what other path did we create? We created this recipe path. So if I type in / recipe, I don't get recipe, and this is because React Router can be a huge dick at times. So to fix that, all we need to do is we need to give in the keyword exact right there to the topmost component. What this is going to do is it's going to make sure that only render out this app component when this path is exactly this / and there is nothing else in front of it. So now if you press save, go back to the web browser, we can see that we are indeed on this recipe path and we are getting this recipe component render out to our application. Okay, so now let's actually make the button work. So what I mean is, this button right there, let's actually make this work. So when we press it, we actually get taken to that recipe. Okay, so to do that, it's going to be a bit more complicated than what we are used to, but let's give it a go. So back in this router.js file, we don't really want this static recipe path. What we want is we want a path parameter. or in other words, it's also called a route parameter. So to start a route parameter, you type in colon, and then anything that goes after it is considered as a parameter or a variable. So what do we need in this case? Well, you can name it anything, but we're gonna grab the recipe ID to access the data of the recipe. So for the sake of simplicity and relevance, let's just type in ID. Okay, now this path will only work. So if I just simply go to recipe, it's not going to work. So / recipe, you can see that it's not going to work. And this is because it's also going to take a route parameter. So if I type anything after that, let's say if I type in 1, then we can see that the recipe component is indeed showing up. Okay, so this is how it's going to work. So what's next? Well, you know, this button, this view recipe button, this lives inside of this recipes.js file, which is this thing right there. So to make this work, we're gonna grab another named export from the React Raw to DOM package, and let's just type it in first. Come on. And this package is called, well, this is a named export indeed, so this is called link. Now this link essentially works the same as the anchor tag in HTML. All it does is it directs you to whatever link it is, pointing at. So to do that, let's just first go ahead and split this button into multiple lines. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this view recipe text, and there I'm just going to go ahead and throw in this view recipe and convert this to a link. It's not going to do anything just yet, but let's just go ahead and press save, go back to the web browser, search for the recipes, and our application breaks. This is because we need to specify a to attribute to this link right there. So essentially it's the same as saying, so to is basically telling it what path does it need to go to. So in our application we have 2 paths. So what we're doing here is we need to tell this link to which of these 2 paths to go to once it's been clicked. So now obviously we need to go to this recipe / ID, and now remember this is a parameter, so anything that goes in there gets replaced by this ID parameter. Okay, so we're actually going to make use of template strings right there because we need to inject some variables. So to do that, how do we do that? Because the template strings don't really seem to be working. Well, to fix this, all we need to do is we need to open up a JavaScript expression, and then inside of it we need to open up a object, and then we type in path name. Now this is where we're going to assign the path. So if the path is, and let's set it to template literals, because remember inside of a JavaScript expression we can use the template literals. So if the path is / recipe, now again this is ID, so that means we need to grab the ID of the recipe. So remember, we are in fact mapping over the whole recipes array right there. So to grab the recipes, all we need to do is / recipes, and then remember we can inject the variables. So to throw in the recipe ID, we can just say that recipe. So remember, this recipe is referring to this recipe argument right there. So recipe dot, and then the properties that we need is called, come on, it's not there, recipe _ ID. Okay, and now how do we actually proceed with that? I mean, yes, we do have this path provided. So if I go back to the web browser, press search, and you can see that this has indeed been converted to a link. So now if I hover over it, I get this hand sign, and then it's showing me that it's actually a link. So let's see what happens when we press this button, view recipe, boom. We do indeed get taken. So remember, this is the recipe. This is the recipe ID, and once we hit it, we get taken to this recipe route right there. So now if we choose a different recipe, let's say we click on that, we can see that the recipe ID has been changed because the recipe ID is just a number, and that is what we're using to throw into our URL. Does that make sense? Well, I hope it does. Okay, so what's next? Well, how do we actually access the data inside of this recipe.js file? First of all, we need to convert this to a class-based component because we're going to use some of the properties that are only available inside of the class-based component. So to do that, class recipe extends react.component. Excellent. Let's just open up a pair of curly braces, type in render, and return some JSX. So for now, let's just return again the recipe component. Okay, press search, go back to the web browser, make sure everything is working fine. Yes, it is. Okay, so if we didn't know any better, we wouldn't know that what's going on inside of this recipe component. But we do indeed have access to props, right? So if I type in console.log and then just props. So all we're doing here is we're just console logging the props. So as soon as this component is loaded, it says props is not defined, and this is because we need to log this.props. Okay, go back to the web browser, open up the console. So there we go, and we do indeed have an object. So if I expand it, this is just a lot of React Router stuff that's been bound to this recipe component because we specified it right there in this recipes.js file. So the reason we are getting all this React Router stuff is because we created a link right there, and then this link belongs to React Router. So that means it's been bound to this recipe component as well. Okay, so now if we go ahead and take a look at it, we can see that we have a location object, and if I expand it, this is the path name that we set right there in recipes.js file. This thing right there. Okay, and we also have another property called state, and this is what we're going to use in order to display the actual recipe onto this recipe component. So to do that, what are we going to do? Well, back in this recipes.js file, we are going to create an other attribute inside of this object right there. So right after this string ends, actually let me just break it down to a new line. So path name, and then I believe it's that one right there, and this one is going to be called state. Okay, now this state is going to contain another object, and the name of the object is going to be recipe. Okay, and let's just call it. Now, like I said, we're going to use the recipe title in order to display the data. So to do that, let's just say recipe dot and then title. And we do have access to this recipe because we are mapping over a recipe array, and then we are setting up this recipe argument right there. Press save, go back to the web browser, and again expand this object, and if I refresh it, we can see that the state is still undefined. And this is because the state is only going to get called when we press this button. Now in this case, this page is merely getting refreshed. We are not coming here because the button has been pressed. So the state is only going to get set once we actually press the button. So now if I go back all the way to my app component, and again we type in chicken, press search, just go to any recipe, let's just try that one. And now if I open up my console, we can see we have an object, and there we do have a state object, and inside of it we have the title, which is called, well, whatever it was called, chicken parmigiana. I don't know what it is, but anyway, the good news is that we can use this state to display the data onto this recipe application. Okay, so let's just do that now. So back in this recipe.js file, there is a reason why I set this up as a class-based component. And the reason is that we're going to make use of state inside of this component, okay? So first of all, let's just go ahead and declare our state, and the state's gonna be called active recipe. And for now, let's just set it to an empty array. Okay, well what's next? Well, we're gonna make use of a React built-in method, or in other words, called a lifecycle hook called component.did.mount. This method is going to get fired as soon as this component gets loaded or gets mounted onto the web browser. So anything that happens inside of it is going to happen as soon as this component loads on the screen, okay? And we're actually going to do something pretty similar to what we did in app.js. So for the most part, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy everything that's inside of this getRecipe method, and we're just going to change a few things. For now, let's just paste them, and we also need our API key. Okay, copy this, go back to the recipe component and paste it right there. So what exactly are we going to change? Well, there is no recipe name in this component because obviously there is no form. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and I'm going to instead type in title, because the title is what we're going to grab in order to display the data. So title is, well, what do we equal it to? We have an object there, right? So this dot props, and then its location. So this dot props dot location, and then location dot state, and then the property is called recipe. And remember, we are getting this because back in recipes.js file, we set up the state and then state.recipe. Okay, so this dot location, actually is this dot props dot location, and then it's state, and then it's recipe. Excellent. So now what we need to do is we need to replace this recipe name with this title right there, because this recipe name constant does not exist anymore. And we can also get rid of this count. Okay, so we can get rid of that, and I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to paste it right there. And we don't need this e.preventDefault because there is no form right there, so we can just go ahead and get rid of that as well. Alright, so next up, let's just change the names of these two constants because they already exist inside of this app.js file. And it's not going to make a difference, but it's best not to have any duplicates. So I'm going to change this to rec or request, and I'm going to change that to res or results or response, whatever you want to call it. And let's just get rid of these two statements right there. And for now, let's just console log this res right there. Alright, so press save, go back to the web browser, and it says that API call is not defined, and line number 13. So let's take a look at what's going wrong. Alright, of course, we need to change this to rec. Okay, press save, go back to the web browser, and we are on the recipe component, and there we go. We do have a count showing up, but it's actually 18 recipes it's giving us. And the reason for this is because the recipe that we clicked on maybe has more than one name. So, you know, it's cashew chicken pasta. You can see there's quite a few of these. So to fix that, the most relevant recipe is going to be the topmost recipe in the array. In this case, the index is 0. So instead of grabbing everything that's inside of this recipes array, what we can do is we can say res. So remember, res is this whole object. So res.recipes, and then we just need to grab the first element in the array. So in this case, we're going to grab the element with the index of 0. Okay, press save, go back to the web browser, and now we can see that we're only getting the recipe with this ID that we searched for, which is 46996, and this is the title, and these are all the images and, you know, the publisher that we're going to use to display the data. Okay, brilliant. So what's next? So now we're going to make use of this active recipe state right there to actually display the data onto our actual screen. Okay, so to do that, let's just get rid of this console log right there for now, and instead just type in this dot set state, and then it's going to take an object, and then we're going to assign the active recipe state the exact same thing that we were console logging earlier. So that was res.recipe and then the first index inside of it. Okay, press save, and now instead of console logging the res object, let's just console log the actual state. So this dot state dot active recipe. Press save, go back to the web browser, and we should still get back the same thing but beyond. So let's take a look why. So it says, actually it should be recipes. Okay, now this should work. Let's go back to the web browser, and yes, we are indeed getting back the same thing. Okay, so now how do we use this piece of state to actually display the data onto our actual, this whole screen right there? Well, let's just add a bit of structure inside of this render method. So I'm actually going to get rid of this whole thing, and you're just going to have to watch me type a bunch of markup using the classes and some of the Bootstrap classes. So the first one we're going to start off with is called container, and this is going to act as the wrapper div. And then inside of container, what we're going to do is, I think the next class that comes is because we don't need to add a row, because in this case we aren't really throwing in any columns. All we need is just a big image, and then underneath that just the title and the publisher, and that's it. So we don't really need to add any rows or anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to throw in a custom class that I've written, and this is called active recipe. Okay, let's crack open this, and inside of it we're going to grab the image. So remember, we do have access to all these properties just like we did in app.js file. So in this image tag, I'm going to give it a class of, I believe is active recipe _ image, and then the source is going to be Now, see, if we type in this .state.active recipe and then, grab all these values, this is going to get a bit messy. I mean, we're going to have to do this for the title. We're going to have to do this for the publisher, for the website. So an easy way to fix this is to actually store that into a constant. So just above this return statement, what we can do is we can create a new constant, and we can call it recipe, and then we can set it to this .state.active recipe. Okay, so now instead of typing out this whole thing, we can just copy this and we can paste it right there. And now that's all we need to type in order to grab the values of the object. Okay, so now recipe dot and then it's image _ URL. And for the alt tag, let's just give it recipe dot title. Excellent. Press save. Let's take a look at what's going on in the web browser, and there we go. We do have the image showing up, and this is brilliant. So that means everything is working fine. So let's move on. Okay, so right below this image tag, I'm going to throw in a h3 title tag, and I'm going to give it a class name of, I think it's, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this active recipe because this is the prefix to every class name, and then the prefix is title. Okay, and the title is obviously going to be recipe dot title. Okay, moving on, let's add a h4 in there, and I'm going to give this a class name of, I think it's active recipe, and then we're going to also grab this publisher because we're just going to show that who actually created this recipe. So we're going to grab this publisher property. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this whole thing and paste it right there, and I'm going to replace this title with, I think it's publisher. Yep. Okay, and within there, let's just throw in, actually let's just break this into a multiple line because we're also going to throw in a span tag. So let's type in publisher, and then open up a span tag, and then inside of it I'm just gonna grab the property, so recipe.publisher. Okay, brilliant. So what's next? Well, just below this h4 tag, let's throw in a paragraph tag and give it a class name of, I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this active recipe __, and this is going to be the website of the publisher. So in this case, we're gonna grab, come on, where is the website? So publisher URL, recipe ID, title, I think it's this one right there, source URL. Yep, that's it. Oh, publisher URL, actually, this one right there. So this is the property that we're going to grab in order to let users know that, you know, this is the website of this recipe creator. So again, we're going to break this down to a new line, and I'm just going to type in the word website right there, add in a colon, and then right there I'm going to type in a span, and I'm going to give that inside of it, it's going to be an anchor tag, because obviously we need to redirect our users to their website. So the href is going to be, so what is it? Recipe.publisher URL. Okay, recipe.publisher and then _URL. And within there, let's just type in the exact same thing. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy this and paste it right there, because we're actually going to display the website onto the screen as well. Alright, so the last thing that we need in there is the actual button that we are going to go ahead and create now. So button, and this is going to be responsible for taking us back to the home page. So let's just give it a class name of, and I'm just gonna go ahead and copy this active recipe thing, paste it right there, and then it's called button. Okay, and let's just type in go home. Brilliant. Press save, go back to the web browser, and we should have our desired results. Yes, we do. Okay, so now you may notice that before the page loads, this whole blank thing is showing up right there, and we don't want that. So what do we do to change that? Well, let's just make a check. We can check that if the because, you know, since all these values are coming from the state, so we can just make a simple check that if this state has a length of 0, then we don't want to display anything, because if it's 0, that means that this array is empty, this active recipe state is empty, which means that nothing is inside of it. So as soon as it gets filled, we can actually display our data. Okay, so to do that, I'm actually going to cut out everything that's inside of this active recipe div and open up a JavaScript expression, and inside of it I'm just going to type, so we're going to make use of the AND operator. So as you know, for the AND operator, both of the conditions have to be true in order for something to execute. Okay, so we can say that this dot state dot active recipe, and then since it's an array, we can grab the length property, and we can check that if this is not equal to 0, so again, if anything is inside of this array, the length is going to be greater than 0. So if this dot state dot active recipe's length is not equal to 0, only then do we want to render out everything that's inside of this div that we just cut out. So there we are making use of the AND operator, and now we can just go ahead and paste our div right there. Excellent. So I'm just going to indent some of the stuff in, just like that. Oh, actually, this should be there, and then this should be there. Okay, now if we go back to the web browser, we can see that nothing shows up until the page actually loads and then the state gets filled. So we need to actually make this go home button work as well. So how do we do that? Because, you know, we can't really make use of the actual A tag, because that's going to result into a full page refresh. So if you are guessing that we're going to make use of React Router, then you are absolutely right. So First of all, we need to grab a named export from React Router. Okay, and that is going to be link. And remember, we did use this link right there in recipes as well, and that is exactly what we're going to do inside of this recipe component as well. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and break this button down into multiple lines, cut this out, and open up a link tag and paste it right there. Now, the only thing that we need to provide here is the path name. So remember, we have two paths. We have the home path and then we have the recipe path. So currently inside of this recipe component, we are indeed on the recipe path. So right there, all we need to do is we need to say that once this button has been clicked, take us back to home page. So for the home page, the path is /. Okay, so now if we go back to the web browser, and we can see that this has been converted to a link, and if I press this, we get taken to the home page, and from there on we can search for another recipe. So actually, let's type something different because we have used chicken quite a bit. Okay, shrimp, and then let's just go to one of these, view recipe, and then yeah, it's working just fine. From there on, we can go back to our home page using this Go Home button. Okay, so our application is pretty much done for the most part. The only thing that's left now is, when we go back to the home page, our results are gone. So we want, we want to keep our results. When we go back to the home page, we don't really want to search through the, the index again and grab everything. We want our results to be there just the way they were before we navigated away from this page. So let's take care of that inside of our app.js file. Okay, so I'm just gonna close everything else because I don't think we need anything else anymore. Now inside of this app.js file, we're gonna make use of a couple new React lifecycle hooks. And those two are component did update and component did mount. Actually, we've used component did mount already, so the only new one is component did update. So component did update works something like this. We don't really need these two arguments because these are for something a little more advanced. But essentially, the way this works is whatever happens inside of this method is going to happen as soon as the component has updated. And when does the component usually update? Well, when the state changes, okay? So as soon as the state updates, the component is going to update as well. So as soon as that happens, what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a constant, all right? And we're gonna call it recipes. And then we're just gonna make use of the local storage to store our data. So what we're gonna do is, first of all, we're gonna convert this into, our recipe state into the JSON format, because local storage only takes strings. It doesn't take any objects, it doesn't take any arrays, it doesn't take any numbers, nothing. It just takes string. It just takes the string. So JSON basically is just a one big string. So to convert this, we're gonna say JSON.stringify. And then what do we need to stringify? Well, we need to stringify this recipe state. So JSON.stringify, and then this .state.recipes. Okay, so once that's been done, we need to actually assign it to local storage. So to do that, we can just say local storage, and then to set an item in local storage, you use the property called setItem. And it takes a couple of arguments. The first one is the name of the item, which is going to store this recipe array right there. So we need to provide that in a string. So I'm just going to call it recipes. And the second argument is the actual thing that you want to store. And in this case, we want to store our recipes, our recipe state. So this is what we're going to type in right there. Okay. So now if we go back to our web browser, open up the state, and let's just search for chicken, because right now it hasn't been updated, but it's going to get updated as soon as we press search, because that's when the state updates. So now from there, let's just look for local storage because I kind of forgot where it lives. So performance, application, local storage, and there we go. We can see that everything that we looked for is inside of this recipes object. So right there, if we type in local storage dot get item, and then what did we set the item to? Is recipes, right? So get item is another method on local storage which we can use to grab the items that we set. So in this case, we set the recipes item right there. So we can say local storage dot get item, and then if you press enter, we can see that we are getting everything in form of a string. So you can see this is a quotation mark and it ends right there at the end. And this is why it's a very ugly format, because this is not JSON, this is just a one big string. Alright, so what's next? Well, once we have actually set this to local storage, now using another lifecycle hook called component did mount, we're just going to, oh, that's not it. Now, in this method, we are just going to fetch everything that's inside of our local storage. So to do that, we first need to grab our stored item, which in this case is recipes. So I'm just going to create a new constant and I'm going to call it JSON. Okay, and I'm going to set it to local storage dot, and then in order to get an item, we use the get item property, and then we're going to grab the recipes item that we just set. Okay, so now we first need to convert it to the actual JSON format, because currently it's in the string format, because we can't display any strings or any of the type onto the web browser, so it has to be in JSON. Okay, so we can say we can create a new constant called recipes, and then we can say JSON, and then to parse a string we say JSON.parse, and then we can pass in this JSON constant right there. Okay, excellent. So now all we need to do is we just need to set this recipes to this recipe state right there. Okay, so this dot set state, and then an object, and then recipes, and then this constant right there. Okay, and now one neat bit of syntax in ES6 is that if the name of the property and the key, if these two names are the same, then you can just make it something like this. Okay, if it was something like recipe, then we would actually have to type it this way, but in ES6, if the names of the keys and the values are the same, then you can just do something like this. Okay, now if we press save, go back to the web browser, we can see that we are indeed going through a full page refresh, but nothing is changing. We can see that we are still getting the results. And let's just look for something else. Let's look for garlic, press search, and let's just view one of these recipes. Let's just view this one, and we are indeed getting it back. Now if you go back to the home page, we can see that we still have the recipe that we searched for. Okay, well, this is it for this video, and I really hope you learned something from it. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.